Halo Infinite is finally in the hands of fans after 6 years of development. Now that we've had a chance to experience the latest chapter in Master Chief's saga, we're sure many of you have been left with a number of questions, such as who the Endless are, what exactly happened to Atriox, and above all, just what in the 7 rings is happening in that legendary ending. Luckily, IGN is here to break down Halo Infinite's endings and what they mean for Halo's future. Naturally, there are spoilers ahead. Before we can talk about the legendary ending, let's talk about the conclusion to Halo Infinite's campaign. During the 6 months Master Chief spent chilling in the cold of space, the Banished began digging into Zeta Halo to uncover a being known as the Harbinger. A member of a race known as the Endless, the Banished knew little about her other than Atriox thought her important. Upon releasing the Harbinger, the Banished found that they shared at least one common interest: repairing the now damaged Zeta Halo. An alliance is formed, and you basically know the rest from there. At Halo Infinite's conclusion, Master Chief is ultimately able to put an end to the Harbinger, but she succeeds in her main goal, ensuring the return of the Endless. We'll talk more about them in just a bit. Now that we're all on the same page, let's take a look at the after-credits scene for Halo Infinite before we dive into the even juicier legendary ending. As the after-credits scene opens, we find ourselves on another part of Zeta Halo. An alive, though scarred Atriox approaches a pedestal and places an unknown artifact on it. This same artifact, or another sharing its design, appeared during the campaign and seemed to share some connection to the Harbinger. Once the artifact is in place, a door opens revealing several Silexes, devices that first appeared in the Halo Legends episode, Origins Part 1. Part of a Forerunner effort to ensure life would survive the firing of the Halo array, the appropriately named conservation effort collected DNA samples and even living specimens from across the galaxy. These were stored or indexed at the Ark, the extragalactic forge for the Halo rings, and the one place safe from the deadly radiation Halo unleashed. Silexes are essentially a sort of Forerunner suspended animation chamber, and while they have been used for benevolent means, the ones on Installation 07, however, seem to have darker purposes. When the 7 rings of the Halo array fired over 100,000 years ago, their radiation was meant to wipe out any potential source of sentient life that could be used by the Flood. The Flood grow and expand by absorbing sentient life, then using the knowledge and bodies absorbed to continue to expand and absorb until nothing but the Flood remains. The Halos combat this with a scorched earth policy, wiping out any potential sources of food, so to speak, for the Flood, essentially starving it to death.
The only way to stop the Flood is to starve them to death. And that's exactly what Halo is designed to do: wipe the galaxy clean of all sentient life.
And yet, the Endless somehow survived. The deadliest weapon in the known universe, and the Endless were seemingly unaffected. From what slivers of information are revealed in Halo Infinite's audio logs, we know that 117649 Despondent Pyre, the monitor of Installation 07, discovered the Endless after the rings had fired. Moving Installation 07 into the space above the Endless homeworld, Pyre then contacted what remained of Forerunner Society to advise a course of action. For anyone who might be confused by that last statement, allow us to clarify. When the Halo array was fired 100,000 years ago, around 97,445 BCE, incidentally, a small group of Forerunners managed to survive on the Ark.
The Ark is out of range of all the active installations.
For the most part, they simply oversaw the reseeding or reintroduction of life into the galaxy, ensuring living specimens were safely returned to their homeworlds, and that the array would be ready should it be needed in the future. However, things are never so simple when it comes to the Forerunners. Once informed of the existence of the Endless, the Forerunners orchestrated a meeting with them, which resulted in the Endless being locked away on Zeta Halo. What Atriox wants with the Endless is something we'll likely need to wait a while to discover, but perhaps more curious than his interest in the Endless is the symbol we see on their Silexes. It has a notable similarity to the Banished's own symbol, though that is meant to be Atriox's Chainbreaker gravity mace seen from above. Maybe the similarity is a coincidence, maybe it's purposeful, but we'll likely need to wait to find out. With that though, we can finally dive into the legendary ending. While the visuals are the same as the normal after-credits scene, fans who beat Halo Infinite on legendary difficulty are greeted with additional narration. In 97,368 BCE, 77 years after the firing of the Halos, a Forerunner known as the Grand Edict is speaking with Monitor Despondent Pyre about containing the Endless. Pyre raises concerns about the irregularity of this process, but the Grand Edict has made up his mind. The Endless must be contained. The Grand Edict then says he'll tell another Forerunner known as the Criterion to proceed, presumably to proceed with the containment of the Endless. He adds this must be done to preserve order and, quote, their truth, reflecting something Despondent Pyre brings up in the game's audio logs. In the Forerunner audio logs, Despondent Pyre at one point speculates that what the Forerunners feared above all else, even the Flood, was losing their power. The Grand Edict goes on to say that the Endless will be forgotten by time, to which Despondent Pyre replies,
"Time is not a construct we can control."
The Grand Edict then responds,
"And we cannot allow it to be theirs."
Many fans have speculated that this could be alluding to time travel, some even thinking that Atriox himself has been sent back in time. However, the Grand Edict likely isn't talking about time travel. With the Endless being an advanced species immune to the Halo array, the Grand Edict was more likely worried about them overshadowing Forerunner plans for humanity. To keep the perceived threat of the Endless at bay, they were locked up on Installation 07, where they could be studied in the ensuing eons by engineers, the floating squid-like beings fans may recognize from Halo 3 ODST and Halo Reach. Despondent Pyre notes that this will be a difficult task to accomplish alone, but the Grand Edict assures the Monitor that she won't be alone, as
Offensive bias has been deployed.
Who is offensive bias, though? To answer this, we'll need to go back to Halo 3. Hidden on key levels in Halo 3's campaign were bonuses called Terminals, which contain details from the Forerunner Flood War from 100,000 years prior. Among the many details found within these terminals was a record of Mendicant Bias, the most advanced Ancilla, or artificial intelligence, the Forerunners ever created. Unfortunately, when Mendicant Bias was deployed on a mission to learn as much about the Flood as possible, it was corrupted and ended up joining the Flood. To counter Mendicant, the Forerunners created Offensive Bias. Another highly capable AI, Offensive Bias wasn't allowed to be quite as independent as Mendicant, a measure to make sure history wouldn't repeat itself. As the Halos were being prepared to fire, Mendicant Bias and the Flood launched an all-out assault on Forerunner space. Offensive Bias was tasked with holding them back. Though grossly outnumbered compared to Mendicant, Offensive Bias merely had to hold out until the Halo array had activated. Once it did, Offensive Bias was able to turn the tide of battle, defeating Mendicant Bias and bringing it to the Ark for a final trial. While we have details about what Mendicant Bias got up to in the years since the Halo array was fired, he's actually the reason the Master Chief winds up on Requiem, incidentally, Offensive Bias has almost never been mentioned in a Halo game, let alone made an appearance. While some fans would surely much rather see Mendicant Bias appear, especially given Mendicant's deep connections to Installation 07, one of the great advantages of introducing Offensive Bias into the game is the lack of information on the AI. Offensive Bias has very little pre-existing story or lore, meaning 343 can potentially do a lot more with it than they could with Mendicant Bias. Interestingly, Offensive Bias may have already shown signs of its presence. Towards the end of Halo Infinite, while the weapon is trying to stop the Harbinger from freeing the Endless, she notes that something in the system appears to be helping her. And of course, at the end, a mysterious portal opens just as Master Chief and the weapon need an exit. Could these have been the first signs of Offensive Bias? Now, as excited as we are about Offensive Bias potentially making an on-screen appearance, we can't ignore the other two names dropped in the legendary ending, the Grand Edict and the Criterion. An edict is a simple decree or announcement, usually in relation to the law, and a criterion is a principle or standard by which something can be judged. In short, both names have direct connections to the law. Forerunner society was made up of several rates, as they were called, a sort of caste system that left some Forerunners better off than others. One of these was known as the juridical rate. As the name implies, juridicals were essentially the law keepers of Forerunner society. While we obviously can't say for certain at the moment, it's possible that the Grand Edict and Criterion are surviving members of the juridical rate. Halo Infinite's campaign gave a lot of questions for fans to chew on, and its various endings have only added to the wealth of speculation. Offensive Bias is finally set to appear after over a decade of mystery, new Forerunner characters have been introduced, and now that the resting place of the Endless has been found, Atriox may potentially lead the most powerful force the galaxy has seen since the final days of the Forerunners. Halo Infinite was a brilliant first step into a new yet familiar world, and it looks like 343 Industries has some big plans cooking up for the future. Well, that's all we have for this video. If you're itching for more Halo, check out our recent breakdown of the first trailer for the Halo TV series, or our primer for the key players in Halo Infinite. For everything else in the world of Halo, you're already in the right place. IGN.